Alright, hey, this is Mr. Abbott, and this is our video for lesson number 3 on economics concepts that are implied by action. Now, you should be watching lesson 2. We're going to get to lesson 3 later this week, so I want to get this video in your hands so you can kind of get the big picture. In this lesson, the idea is 3 things. Is that individuals, not groups, can make choices. It's individuals that make choices, not groups. We'll explain that. When people do make choices, they have preferences. Their choices are guided by preferences, and then there's a way to think about preferences. Preferences are very subjective. They're not very objective. So let's take a look at what Robert Murphy has to say about this. Again, now economics, as he says on page 31, is a methodical or scientific study of exchange, okay? People are always making exchanges, and it's very definitely a purposeful action. People do things on purpose. As you know from chapter 2, we're not talking about mindless behavior where things just happen. We're talking about people making purposeful actions, and so that's what he's talking about. And when he says that, he says to have an action, you have to have an actor. Oh, by the way, I know some of you have probably commented on my stylish feminine reading glasses, but you know what? They were $1 at the dollar store. They're cheap. They work, okay? So I economize. Purposeful action. Actions, when there are actions done, there has to be an actor, okay? Someone does the acting. So, an intelligent person does the purposeful actions. That's what he's talking about on page 32 over to page 33. All right? So he says, in fact, on page 32, if we as economists are going to explain an event by referring to a purposeful action, it obviously implies that there is some individual performing the action. There must be some intelligent being whom the consciousness belongs. And then he says on page 33, when we decide to interpret a purposeful action, we are necessarily supposing that there must be an intelligent individual carrying out the action. There cannot be an action without an actor. And then he goes on to talk about, so he talks about purposeful action, and when you see something, there's something that happens, somebody did something, and then the logical deductions trying to figure out maybe why that person did what they did, all right? So when we talk about economics, we're talking about purposeful actions done by people, okay? Only individuals can act. And then he spends a little time in the chapter talking about the difference. Like, for example, he uses this great illustration on the bottom of page 34. For example, he says that a historian might write, in 1941, Japan attacked the United States. Well, strictly speaking, he says this is nonsense. Japan can't attack because Japan is a large entity group, but individual Japanese pilots were the ones who landed bombs on Pearl Harbor. And if you take that over, as he says, to the bottom of page 35, and you get that kind of thinking, when we say, well, the government ripped me off, the government took this, the government took that, I'm going to do this to the government, that's ridiculous, because a government is an entity. It can't act. But there are people who make up the government, and individuals, and it's those people that make things up that are the actors. And so when someone says, government's going to regulate me, well, what's actually happening is there's individuals who are going out and acting for a group. And so only individuals act. Okay, that's what the point that the big picture that you want to get from this. Okay, now when individuals act, then the second thing to know is that they have preferences. All right, preferences. And if you look, that's one of the bold print words. And remember, bold print words are terms that you have to write out the definition and use it in a complete sentence each week. He says we use the word preferences to describe the feelings. People act the way they do because they prefer the world to unfold one way or the other. And so preferences are go along with what someone thinks and believes, and they're very subjective. So purposeful actions are done by people, not by groups, and the people who do these purposeful actions have preferences, all right? They want the world to be a certain way, they prefer things a certain way, they prefer this, they want things, they like things like this, and so they act accordingly. And when they do that, then the means that they do this with is what we call goods and services. That's on page 37. Economists describe people achieve the means to their ends through the use of goods and services, which are things that we use in economics to create value. So one more word is the word subjective, and that means that when it's hard to classify, it's hard to get your arms around the preferences of the way people act, because they're not objective, they're subjective. Now when we use those two words, objective generally goes by rules and by facts, all right? Subjective is you're not exactly sure how things are going to go. It depends on this, it depends on that. That's what we mean by the term subjective. And preferences are usually not objective, all right? They're generally subjective because we're dealing with people, all right? Not with things, we're dealing with people. And so he talks about preferences, and then of course Robert Murphy spends the last 2 pages talking about preferences you can't really measure them because they're so subjective. Their preferences are generally a ranking. You know, and he uses an illustration about one girl who likes vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. You know, you can't measure it, you can only rank it. You can only say she prefers this over that, and very subjective, okay? Finally, on page 41, he uses a word that's called utility. And in this on this page, it's an alternate view. There are some economists that think that you can measure people's preferences by utility. I like chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, and so the utility is the pleasure that I get from the chocolate ice cream. That's what some economists and economic textbooks would say. But in our understanding in a free market, and our understanding with Austrian economics, that we understand that, no, that's not exactly true. You can't really measure preferences through this utility thing. All you can really say is that someone prefers this over that. You can rank it, but you can't measure it. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and we'll be reading a little bit about that on page 43. He gives a really good illustration about rankings versus measurement. All right, so again, just understand that it's individuals, not groups, that do purposeful actions. Actions are done through preferences, and preferences cannot be measured because they're so subjective. They're here and they change, and so they can't be measured. They can be ranked, but they can't be measured. That's the big picture, so make sure you read through it. We're going to read together in class. Be familiar with the terms: preferences, goods, services, subjective, utility, and progressive income tax. We'll talk more about that in the class. That's on page 46. You're going to have to write those out. Look for the assignments on the Google Classroom, and then the study questions we'll work together on as well. Okay? That's the big picture for lesson 3. And I hope you have a great week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in class tomorrow. Take care.